Hello, everybody, and welcome. I really appreciate you all being here to our inaugural exhibition in our brand new space. Thank you very much. We are thrilled tonight to have Anne Buckwalter, artist on view, and Dodie Bellamy here in conversation about Anne's work and practice and just things in general. To give a brief introduction, and excuse me if I look at my notes a little bit, I don't want to get these details incorrect. Anne Buckwalter lives and works in Durham, Maine. Her work has been included in solo and group exhibitions nationally and internationally. She was featured in group exhibitions at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the Maine College of Art in 2023. That was a little bit more of a mouthful than I anticipated. And in 2021, she received a Paula Krasner Foundation grant. In 2020, a grant from the Idea Fund. She was in residence at the Eli Beauregard Foundation in Rockland, Maine, Mass MoCA in North Adams, and others. Buckwalter has authored a number of books, including Comforter, a collection of short stories, Houseplants, a children's book, and an experimental text about symbols and language entitled Mother Tongue Tied. Laundry Room is Buckwalter's first book of poems. Dodie Bellamy is a novelist, nonfiction author, journalist, and editor, known for her non-professional use of sexuality, politics, and narrative experimentation. Bellamy teaches writing and literature at the California College of the Arts, San Francisco. She's been a member of the San Francisco literary avant-garde since the 1980s and is one of the originators of the new narrative literary movement. She has authored and co-authored numerous publications, including When the Sick Rule the World, her third collection of essays in 2015, The Buddhist in 2011, Academonia in 2006, Pink Steam in 2005, The Letters of Nina Harper in 2004, and Writers Who Love Too Much, New Narrative Writing, 1977 to 1997, an anthology edited with her late husband, writer Kevin Killian. Her most recent book is Bereaved, which was published in 2021. Her Reflections on the Occupy Oakland Movement, The Beating of Our Hearts, was published as a chapbook in conjunction with the 2014 Whitney Biennial. In 2018-19, she was the subject of the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Art's On Our Mind program, a year-long series of public events, commissioned essays, and reading group meetings inspired by an artist's writing and life work. Welcome, Anne Buckwalter and Dodie Bellamy. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, getting to know Anne and her work. So I typed up some questions, so we'll try to move on to spontaneity at some point. Okay, so let's begin talking about your Pennsylvania Dutch heritage and its impact on your art. And so I guess what I'm curious about, was that heritage always something you embraced, and did it always influence your practice, or did you go through some rebellious anything but period?
Yeah, I think I definitely went through a period of not feeling so warm about that part of my history. I think like a lot of people, I have complicated feelings about the town I grew up in. And I also, I think this is common too, like I grew up in a pretty insular community. Lancaster is well known for its Amish population, and my family's not Amish, but they are, they come from Mennonite heritage, so those sorts of traditional values are very steeped into the family I was raised in, and I kind of didn't know much about, until I went to college in Philadelphia, I really didn't know much of any other way of life. And so, yeah, I think I really started kind of wanting to come back to revisiting the sort of aesthetic traditions of Pennsylvania Dutch folk art and textiles and painted furniture and all of those decorative motifs that are so part of that culture when I when I moved out of Pennsylvania, when I moved to Maine for graduate school, and started being like, oh, I guess maybe I'm a little homesick for a place that I never thought I'd be homesick about. And so that's when I started looking at that kind of imagery and sort of weaving it into my work.
And so then did you like fall in love with that imagery? Or?
Yeah, I think that I connected it, like I was starting to like feel nostalgic about it in a way, like I was, in my early 20s at that point, and I think there was like a real sense of, I felt some sort of sense of home or comfort around it, and I also find it's such a, like Pennsylvania Dutch culture is so regionally niche that like sometimes you meet someone and they're like, oh, I grew up in Lancaster, or like I'm from Central PA, and it's almost like it's almost like flagging, like people can like recognize it, and they're like, oh yeah, me too. So that's kind of fun, but
yeah. Okay, so just from looking around online and everything, it's like you're getting, it seems to me from the outside, maybe it doesn't feel to you, on the inside, you've been getting a lot of recognition and acceptance of your work and support for your art, and which I don't think is that easy with art that has like such an overt feminist and sexual content, right? And so I wanted to know, maybe ask about the history of that. I mean, has acceptance of your project always been the case, or has it been a challenge to be taken seriously? Has your work ever been trivialized due to its content?
Ooh, this is such a good question, and I want to know your answer to this question too. Yeah, I think making work about sexuality is often seen as like culturally can be seen as something to be sort of trivialized, or almost like I don't know if I want to say not taken seriously, but I think people jump to maybe like it's funny, and they like read it through a lens of humor first, and sort of de-intellectualize it. And so, yeah, I feel really grateful to have gotten to have the audience that I have for my work, and I think in the last, 8 years or so, as the political climate has changed in the U.S., like I think that there is a hunger for work that's a little more vulnerable and frank about sexuality and queerness and gender, and I think we're living in an exciting time for those conversations to be happening. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. I mean, I sort of am always trying to toe this line with my work of not being so overt that I ostracize people, but also like really exploring the themes as deeply as I want to in my work. So it's I think striking that balance can be challenging for me.
So I was curious about, I guess because I related to this myself, like there's a lot of humor in the work, which, which is hard to do if one is concerned about being taken seriously. So what is the importance of humor, and why are you brave enough to go there in it?
Yeah, I think, that's a hard question to answer. It's definitely, like I don't inherently think about my work as funny, but I do understand like how the potential for it to be read through a lens of humor or with some lightheartedness. And I do think that there is a lot of room for like lightheartedness and thinking about themes that I'm interested in that have a lot of gravity, like sexuality and gender roles and sexual expression. I think a lot of times, those are things that can be really hard to talk about, and I think and this is something I actually really respond to in your work too, the sort of bringing sexuality into the everyday. I think that's one area that I feel like our practices sort of relate to each other. There's, kind of a desensationalizing of it, like talking about a sexual interaction in the same paragraph as talking about, something on the kitchen counter. I feel like there's like a similar vibe that we're going.
Yeah, I was noticing the loving detail of things on kitchen counters and the work here, like they were, playing second fiddle in a way.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a lot around that is like, kind of just, not thinking about sex as a subject that should be surrounded by shame, like normalizing it and thinking about it as more of an everyday, almost mundane topic, I guess.
Yeah. So these like domestic, kind of flat domestic interiors that are very stiff, and they come across as pretty heteronormative, but you've spoken about how queerness is really important to your work.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of interested in like, I don't know if this is something you think about, but I think a lot about binaries, and I think like in a way, queerness and straightness have also become binaries, and like it's funny because I think sometimes I don't fully I feel maybe a sense of ambivalence around a sense of belonging to one of those particular groups, and like a need to choose almost or something. But I'm very interested in those sort of like slippery in between spaces between binaries, and like the way that I paint is very like rigid and controlled, and then the subject matter is like, alluding to things that are very much about not having control, or like playing with control. And so I think I'm definitely interested in that relationship. And then there's also so much of the aesthetics that I was raised with are very like conservative, and there's a lot of control in patterns and very tiny spaces and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's funny. I was reading, the CDC just came out with a study recently that I was reading about a few days ago that apparently like the loneliest people in America are bisexuals and trans people. And I was like, how do you measure loneliness with any sort of consistent yardstick? I guess, first of all, that's kind of interesting.
But they're not in California. So I think of trans people having incredible communities here. But
yeah, but I think for me there's something about that, like the people who sort of exist in like kind of in between spaces, or like they're not committing to being part of a binary group. Like I don't know, maybe
like bisexuals are like 70s swingers kind of an attitude toward them.
Yeah, I think there's still like a lot of stereotypes around people who don't who resist like identifying with one particular identity, maybe.
That's it. Yeah. Interesting. There was one other thing I wanted to. I guess not. We'll just move on. Okay. In an interview in Art Space, you identified 3 general themes that guide your creative practice. So rather than me reinventing the wheel, I'll just read them. Creating intentional ambiguity is one. Exploring female identity and embracing contradictions. Can you unpack those a bit?
Sure. I'll try to do it in that order.
What's the order you wrote?
Oh, yeah.
Intentional ambiguity.
Okay.
Exploring. Well, let's just start with intentional ambiguity.
Okay. Yeah. I think painting is sort of a language of intentional ambiguity anyway,
And how so?
Well, like for example, I find writing to be like at least 100 times more challenging than painting, because you have to really be specific. Like verbal language is so specific, and I feel like with visual language you're able to sort of, I feel like I have more opportunities to like kind of get away with being vague and sort of invite the viewer to bring what they want to bring to the work. And I think you can do that with writing, but I don't think I can do that with writing very well. I think writers that I love, make it look easy, and it's really hard to do. But I think there's also something about ambiguity that, for me, is also part of that, like not wanting to be too binary with any sort of interpretation. That's also part of it for me.
And it's also kind of invites the viewer to participate in the work more.
Yeah, I think I like to include like elements and objects in the paintings that people can respond to, like based on their own personal lived experiences. And I mean, the objects in these paintings are like very personal to me, but a lot of them are quite ubiquitous also, everyday household items. So, what was the
The
next
second one was exploring female identity. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
it's kind of obvious, right?
I'm a female, and I feel like my relationship to like how I think about my own expression of femininity has changed a lot throughout my life, and I've like gone through different phases of being like very, very femme and like very girly, and then being more of a tomboy. And I think as I get older, I'm less and less interested in like performing a certain kind of traditional femininity. And so I think a lot about like what is that? What's my definition of it? What does it mean? Is that something you think about?
Well, I'm kind of old, so yeah, of course. But yeah, or like I kind of look back on my attempts to perform a certain type of femininity and failing. It's really not a failure.
Right.
You know what I mean? But I just sort of think when you were saying that one poem, it's a long one in the book that I'm not going to ask you to read. It's about the history of all your bras.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to encapsulate all these different relationships to femininity, right?
Yeah, for sure. Like I think I like hated wearing bras when I first started having to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's pretty common. But I also feel like there were a lot of girls who like really loved it and embraced it, and like I didn't feel that way at all. But I think like then there, you go through these stages being like, well, I'm supposed to like it, so I have to like it. And it's just, I don't know. It's just never simple.
I know. There's so many voices. And one more, embracing contradictions. I think we've kind of talked about that. Or anything else you want to say about that?
I mean, I think we're like people are inherently complicated, and we generally don't have like a lot of like culturally we tend to not have a lot of tolerance for that. We like things to be like clear and not nuanced and easy to understand. And so, but I think like a lot of times we experience emotions that are like in conflict with each other simultaneously. And so like I think with my work, like I think it's very much about trying to reconcile the sort of traditional values that I grew up with who I am now. And I think like there's, I think that's like a really human, like easy to relate to thing that a lot of people feel.
No, sure. I think that's why I've been kind of going back to Jungians again, because they seem very fine with contradictions.
Yeah. Totally, like the shadow self is like always there. Yeah.
Like we all have it and stuff. And so in this same place that I was stealing from, you go on to say, I locate the intersection of these themes by making narrative paintings that use mysterious figures and uncanny spaces to think about gender roles, the female body, and intimacy. And so I found that really interesting, because it's not something I thought, though it seems very obvious, to call these narrative paintings. Because I think partially because there's so much about stillness in them. And since I have had the misfortune of having to teach fiction workshops where they worship narrative in this way that, I don't. And so, narrative is always sort of seen as the engine that drives momentum and movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually came up with a theory about that, but in terms of your paintings. But so it's interesting to have these paintings that are all about these stillness and time is gone, and to see them as narrative paintings. So
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I don't believe that narrative has to be like linear or specific or like bound to time in that way. Like, I think I'm like interested in distortion of like perspective, but also like of time. Like, I mean, in this one, there's day and night are happening at the same time, and I think that there's still a sense of narrative in that like timelessness. It's just maybe it's a surreal or absurd narrative.
I mean, like things have happened at some point, you may just not know when. Or something.
Yeah, or they're like about to happen. Like, those sort of moments of tension, I feel like are interesting to try to replicate or illustrate. But I do think of them as narrative, but it's like not a traditional exposition, rising action, climax, falling. Not a traditional setup.
Well, I was thinking sort of the way one thing that I read talked about narrative, that the first thing you do is set up the norm.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think you do that very well. You set up the norm. And then the narrative starts is when you disrupt the norm. And then that propels the action forward, trying to find a new norm. And in that way, it fulfills that narrative expectation, because you're constantly, that's how there's all this tension, because you have this norm of this like kind of prim pattern reality that all these like kinky things are. And I read one article where they kept talking about your work in very sexual terms and calling it kinky and smutty, and I had real issues with it. Do you have issues with it being talked about that way?
No.
Really?
Not really.
Curious.
I mean, I feel like I've gone through phases of putting like maybe more allusions to like BDSM or kink things in the painting. So maybe it was like a specific body of work. But I think I'm fine with it.
Okay. Okay. I'll leave out my essay on voyeurism. But okay, I'll go into that.
I'm
okay.
curious.
Okay, the word tension often comes up in the discussions of your work. A lot of words come up over and over again. And narrative, tension. Okay, so I talked about the tension to the stillness of your work in narrative, which applies movement. But I was wondering who's supplying the narrative, you or the voyeuristic viewer. So I started thinking about epistolary novels because the viewer is given access to a personal correspondence they're not meant to read. So all epistolary novels are voyeuristic. So that's why I was thinking about that and how the actual voyeurism creates this like kind of charge to the work. And so that's obviously that we are all voyeurs when we look at your work, don't you think? In a way?
I think so. I think, actually, I feel sort of a bit like looking at any painting is an act of voyeurism in a lot of ways, like regardless of the subject matter, because it's sort of like peering into someone's interior life in a lot of ways, and I think my work is maybe like a more overt example of that, but I do think that there is something about...
I mean, there's one you just have the binocular.
Oh yeah, that one, very, very voyeuristic. I think it's interesting you were asking me about sort of the words like kink and smut and like being sort of uncomfortable comfortable with that language. And I think I've often bristled at like,
Well, just in
term-
terms of feeling kind of patronizing to the work.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
what I meant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've like maybe in the past sometimes bristled at the idea of what people say that the work is voyeuristic, because I feel, I don't know what it is, but I feel this like sort of defensive like, yeah, I'm not sure what that's about. Like I have to apologize or something, and that reaction is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I really think you'd have to. I kind of thought when I was looking at them online, and like if you go for a walk by yourself at night and you walk through a residential area and people have their lights on and you look inside and it's sort of like all the coziness in the world that's there. And what, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this.
That's like the thing I miss most about living in a city is looking at people's windows at night.
So we have a book that accompanies the exhibit, so I wanted to bring that up. So I read, like half of it last night, I'll be honest. It's long, it's like 80 pages of poetry, but anyway, it was interesting to see. I wanted to talk about how the poetry speaks to the work, because it's rather than creating this sense of distance, it seems to me the poetry is very much about collapsing the distance. We have a first-person narrator most of the time, not all the time, and the speaker is acting very sensually and emotionally with these objects in her life, they're looking at the armpits of a lover's T-shirt and its impact. But we see the same objects, like there's this the laundry's good in the title because there's so much washing machines and laundry in the book. But it's a very different lens. So I thought maybe you could read one of the poems, and I suggested Nursing Bras of Friends. And we could talk a bit about how you see the paintings and the poetry speaking to one another, because this seems very unguarded and unprotected.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, sure. Okay, this is called Nursing Bras of Friends. I visit a friend who is a new mother. Whimpering, the steady hum of the fridge, the old dog looking defeated, that faint custardy newborn smell. A wail rises from the crib, and I watch her unlatch her nursing bra and release a chapped nipple, a weary drop of milk on its tip. Breasts at a job, darkened and heavy with usefulness, seeming warm and lovely, and the scallop shell shapes of cloth, which house them in demure and solemn colors. Other nursing bras I have seen on friends: beige ones, black ones, white ones, a dark blue one on my sister, austere blends of natural fibers and sturdy cotton, the serious color schemes and uncomplicated materials of work. I watch in quiet awe the grasping mouth reaching up on a quest, the flawless choreography of this particular action, the holy, boring sacrament of feeding, of being fed. Meanwhile, my lazy breasts suspended in their frivolous lace, observing. Later at home, I gather them in paltry handfuls, wondering about how the weight of milk would change their shape, texture, and purpose. A friend once told me, as we rode our bikes down Pine Street in the unforgivable sun, that her boyfriend was sucking on her tits during sex, and the burrowing rose of his mouth suddenly drew milk out. Weeks later, a doctor watched and smirked as she pressed on the coral points of her nipples, and two arcs, like she was a Roman fountain of cream-colored liquid, appeared. So, in the densely packed garden of the body's mind, if it imagines there might be someone to feed, it doesn't hesitate. The mysteries of us are innumerable and oceanic, the strange, important threadbare wires that run from the brain and stretch across the great plains of bone and muscle sometimes get crossed, and we don't know why, and we aren't supposed to know why. But if milk is going to get poured, then why refuse the gift of it? Now, apparently, he's grown used to it and drinks from her like he is her child. Lactophilia, a new word I now love, sounding round and fat and whole, not unlike milk on my
So, thank you, lovely. So how do you see the connection between the, I mean, you wrote your poems. Did you feel that, do they fill out the paintings? Do they, or are they just another venue?
I mean, it's funny, I sort of see them as like siblings, rather than like in maybe like directly self-referential. There are a couple of things in the paintings that I did write poems about, but it's only a few things, it's not like a one-to-one. And I wrote the poems in this book, most of them before making the work for this show. So initially I was thinking that there would be more of a direct relationship. Like I would really love to spend some time, thinking about and paying attention to articles of clothing that had been meaningful to me. And like initially I was thinking I would write about them and then paint them. And then I sort of felt like the poems, like a lot of the ideas that I wanted to explore came through in the poems. And so then that sort of liberated me to like go in a little bit of another direction with the paintings. But there are like a couple direct correlations that are pretty obvious. Like there's a black mesh tank top in that painting, and there's a poem about it in this book.
Okay, one last question. You had told me, and then I read someplace online as well, that Lauren Berlant's definition of sex is a touchstone for you.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I wrote it down, which may not be quite accurate, an encounter with otherness that disrupts an accustomed way of being. And it's really interesting because that's a really broad definition.
It's like, yeah, it's everything.
Yeah, so that's what so it suggests that to me, that when exploring sex in your work, you're concerned with something more profound than merely like the relics of acts. And so I wonder how far would you throw that net? Like what is, in terms of what would be called sexual or not, or if you want to talk about the vastness of this definition.
Yeah, well, I remember when we were chatting about that quote, that Berlin quote, I was like, oh, that definition I feel like really also applies to grief, or like other really human, common, seminal things that we all experience.
I taught this class called Sex and Death, and that's basically how I connected the two.
Yeah. Oh, through
this disruption.
Yeah, completely. Well, I think that it's also like, much like grief, it's like a thing that we all will and do experience regularly, and but it is sort of this like incredible force that has so much humongous transformative potential, and and I think, I'm always in favor of like a very expansive definition of sex in general, and I think that is like one of the reasons why I'm also interested in exploring queer sexuality in my work, is because I think queer sex is generally a very expansive definition of the topic. I forget, I just sort of lost my train of thought, but does that?
No.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that we are to open this up to audience questions. So, but is there anything that you want to say about anything that I didn't ask you before we do that?
I loved your questions. I feel like it was great.
I needed that.
I'm like, I don't know. I guess I just want to say thank you to you. I've always been such a fan of your work, and thanks to Rebecca and Mackenzie and Nick, and thanks to everyone for coming to see the show.
So does anyone have any questions for Anne?
You can also ask privately if you don't want to ask in the group.
You ladies covered it.
Oh, go ahead.
Were you making work as a young person in Lancaster?
Yeah, my family is full of artists. I don't know if they would self-identify that way, but my dad taught me to draw when I was a kid, and he's an incredible draftsman, and my grandfather was a wood carver, and my mom was always a seamstress, and so I was like sort of surrounded by creativity in that way, but like very, very domestic creativity. And so, yeah, I was definitely at paintings from a young age. I think I first started seriously thinking about like wanting to be like a capital A artist in like high school, but I've always been interested.
And like a standard high school or one within like,
Oh,
like the context of, Pennsylvania Dutch?
no, I went to a pretty big public school in Lancaster, yeah. Yes.
And a question about your paintings versus the drawings. So I feel like there's an interesting direction that you're going in with this. Sorry, there's a bug like moving around this new suite of drawings. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of how those operate in contrast to the paintings. Because we were talking about this during installation, how there's kind of this open-endedness with kind of the incorporation of drawing and then kind of this minimal painting passages. And we talked a little bit about kind of filling in blanks. And anyway, just wondering if you could talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, I mean the drawings, like the sort of like combination of gouache and graphite, like some like grayscale areas and then areas that are more chromatic. It was like kind of an experiment, and also just I was planning on sort of like filling everything in with paint, and then as often happens, I was like, oh, I like this better when it looks a little bit unfinished. So decided to just leave it, and I think there is like, I don't know, a lot of the visual work that I feel most drawn to has some element of feeling like a little unresolved, and so I think I wanted to like try to maintain that with these and leave some areas that felt more blank and sparse and not full of color, but I think, I mean, I like them. I think they are quite weird. Like the drawings, I feel like they are maybe a little more like surrealistic or something than the paintings. And there's no like, horizon line usually in a lot of them. So they're much more like, I guess open-ended in that way.
I feel like they have like some reminiscences of childhood and puzzles and children's book illustration. Do you think about how do you think about childhood?
Oh, I don't think about childhood. No, just kidding. I mean, I think, so much of my work is, I think, about like sort of thinking about my own childhood and how it has impacted me in my life, and how we're all brought up, how that informs who we are as adults. And I mean, I think it's like they're like objects of childhood so often have this connotation of play and like playfulness and lightheartedness, and I think it's interesting to bring that kind of that sort of vibe into like a context of the sexual and the erotic, and there's overlaps and then there's clear disconnects, and so it's definitely something that's on my mind. I mean, I also think a lot about like traditionally, like femininity has culturally been very tied to motherhood, and I'm a proud childless cat person. So I think that's also something I think about, is like recontextualizing femininity without the connotations of being a mother.
Yeah, these read to me like dollhouses, like dollhouse that I would play with my sister growing up as a little kid. And I like how you don't, there's no faces in here.
Mm-hmm.
It allows me to like project and put my own face in there, or someone else's face. And I think it's kind of very inviting. I mean, these interiors I wouldn't decorate my house this way, but I could have fun with it, and I'm just, but the read to me is like dollhouses, and I really do like that. I can imagine a face in there, or wanting to put a face in there, because it just shifted altogether. It's like, it's nice to have that mystery, like the ambiguity there. I think is really kind of seductive, really kind of wonderful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to allude to the body without showing it, and I think like oftentimes things like furniture or clothing, you kind of, I think of them standing in as almost surrogates for a figure, like showing human presence in that way. But yeah, it's also, I feel like I've got like a couple of people have said the dollhouse reference thing, and I can definitely see that. And at the same time, I was also very much like thinking about building these paintings like quilts, because there's a lot of like patterns kind of bumping up against each other. There's like strange spatial relationships that feel very like two-dimensional, and so, but it can be both. Well, that's it. Thank you all so much.